Good afternoon and welcome to Friday's episode of A Very Brief History of the Community of Christ. This is our last of 5 classes with Apostle Lachlan Mackay. Now, because we're a little bit under time constraints, I'm going to turn things over to Lach.
So let's start by revisiting yesterday briefly because we covered a whole lot of information in a hurry. Questions on things we talked about or things we did not?
Lach, I had just asked Dan while we were waiting for you about, is there any consideration by Emma to go to Utah? Do we know that?
I have not seen anything to suggest that she considered it. When I think about the reasons she didn't, and really the reasons she was in conflict with Brigham Young, I think about the 3 P's. Of course, the big one, she knew that would mean raising your children in an environment where polygamy was the norm. Another one is property. So Nauvoo is built on land purchased on credit. There were limits to how much property a church could own in the state of Illinois at the time. I think it's maybe 20 acres. And we also were just being incorporated. So the mechanism used to own property was something called a trustee in trust. So it's church property in Joseph's name. But at his death, there was no easy way to tell what is the church's in Joseph's name and what is Joseph's in Joseph's name. And it was a mess. And so Emma is worried about feeding her children. Brigham Young is worried about feeding people as they cross the plains. Both are legitimate concerns, but ownership of property became a big issue. Then finally, the 3rd P, papers. Joseph's diaries, journals, letters, scripture manuscripts. Emma believed they were Joseph's and therefore Emma's. Brigham Young believed that the church had paid the scribes and bought the paper and bought the ink and that they were therefore the church's. Again, I kind of understand both positions, but the reality is the copyright would have stayed with the family. But for all of those reasons, there was pretty significant conflict between Emma and Brigham. So I believe she gave no consideration to going west.
You said yesterday that Hiram's family went west.
They did.
Now, was there a reason for that, or was it just the decisions that were made at the time?
Yeah, I think Mary Fielding, Hiram's widow, was by that time loyal to the 12, although she did leave very late and was deeply impoverished. So she left as part of the last maybe 500 to leave Nauvoo as the Battle of Nauvoo was breaking out. So this is September of 1846. There are armed men, actually they have cannons, coming in to drive the last of the Latter-day Saints out. We have joined with what were called new citizens, non-Latter-day Saints that have moved into Nauvoo. We also have put together from steamboat parts cannons. So we are fighting back with artillery, but we lose. And as part of the surrender agreement, every remaining Latter-day Saint had to go. Emma had fled as the battle was breaking out. Mary Fielding Smith, Hiram's widow, and her family flee as well, but they had to cross the river and eventually make their way west. And there was fairly significant conflict between Emma and Mary Fielding, I think, but really what's happening is the two are getting caught up in the succession crisis. So, for example, Emma is secretly moving Joseph and Hiram's bodies or having them moved, doesn't tell Mary Fielding, who finds out and is deeply hurt, understandably. But that's not really an Emma-Mary conflict, it's an Emma-Brigham conflict. We had developed this interesting idea that Joseph's remains would carry spiritual authority, this idea of relics, which of course isn't with us today, but we are squabbling over Joseph's remains as a result, and Emma and Mary are casualties in that squabble. Other questions?
To follow up on what Dave and I were talking about earlier, the city of Fulton on the Mississippi River, Emma went there on September 18th, 1846.
Mm-hmm.
She had 6 relatives living there and over in Amboy and Dixon and Sublette. And he took all the family up there basically to just get away from the whole mess.
Yeah, and then moved back 5 months later when she found out the person leasing her hotel was
Yeah.
about to steal all her furniture.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note on the seal that's shown on the screen there that it's 1872 to 1891.
What that means is we are incorporated in 1872 legally in the state of Illinois. And I don't remember why 1891 is on there. Maybe the year was 1891 at that point in time. You'll also see the palm tree. Did we talk about that?
Yes.
Yeah, the palm tree in the background. Joseph III was one of the people, one of the committee members that designed this seal. Now, this is the corporate seal. So imagine the stamp that you put on legal documents. That's what this is, but somehow it became the much loved symbol of the church. So Joseph had suggested prior to his death that if anything happened to him, Hiram should be next to lead the church. But of course, Hiram is also killed. Joseph had also said after Hiram should be Samuel, another of the brothers. But Samuel dies just a month after Joseph and Hiram. The family believed he had been poisoned. I don't know what happened. I heard an interesting argument last year that the Smith family might have been particularly sensitive to mercury. And so the same dosing that killed Alvin, the oldest brother, that same medicine might have killed Samuel as well. But at any rate, he's gone. So William Smith is the only surviving brother. And then of Joseph and Emma's 11 children, only 5 would make it to adulthood. David, the youngest, born after his father was killed. Succession options. So Joseph had never said, okay, everybody, I'm headed to Carthage. This is dangerous. If anything happens to me, here's exactly what should happen next. He had not said that. And so as a result, there are a number of succession options that fairly quickly develop. Of course, Sidney Rigdon is the surviving member of the first presidency. William Smith is the only surviving Smith brother, who's also a member of the Council of 12 and the Council of 50. So this idea of familial authority, familial priesthood. William Marks, who many believe had the best argument to take Joseph's place, and I think I'm in that camp, as the stake president in the seat of church government. I think he had the best claim to authority. There was a Kirtland revelation that talked about how anywhere the church is organized, in any stake, the standing high council is in charge. But in the rest of the world, the traveling high council is in charge, meaning the 12. So the 12 apostles had no authority where the church was organized early on. That's starting to break down, but because of that argument, Emma Smith was among those who believed William Marks had the best claim. It didn't hurt that William was opposed to polygamy, so of course Emma would have been supportive of that as well. Lyman White soon leads a group down to Texas. He's a member of the Council of 12 and Council of 50. He didn't claim to be Joseph's successor. He thought little Joseph was, but he was just trying to hold things together. Of course, Brigham Young as the president of the 12. Joseph Smith III had been designated by his father on several occasions, but very few people thought that an 11-and-a-half-year-old boy should lead, but some did. James Strang, maybe the most interesting, up Voree, Wisconsin, eventually Beaver Island, Michigan. We saw his scepter the other day. He was the greatest threat to Brigham Young early on and had thousands of followers, had control of Kirtland Temple for a time. He basically gathered up all the people in the branches across the country, and even folks like Martin Harris went on a mission for James Strang to the United Kingdom. So Strang is incredibly charismatic, doing really well early on. And a lot of the people who would become the reorganization either follow James Strang or William Smith. Both, tragically, they're publicly proclaiming monogamy as the appropriate form of Christian marriage. Both, it turns out, are secretly involved in polygamy. Strang was traveling the country with his nephew, Charlie Douglas, who it was discovered was really his first plural wife, dressed up as a boy. So as you can imagine, a pretty significant disappointment to his followers. David Whitmer, another option, and then Alpheus Cutler, who led a group out into Iowa. There is a big showdown initially at not long after Joseph's death. Sidney Rigdon, as the only surviving member of the first presidency, hoped to be a guardian of the church. We typically think that what that means is guardian for little Joseph. And then, of course, versus Brigham Young. Brigham had the support, though, of those that were secretly involved in polygamy, which isn't a lot of people at this point in time. He also had the support of many of the people that he and others in the 12 had converted in the United Kingdom. Emma supported William Marks, but William wasn't particularly interested in leading. He supported Sidney Rigdon. Many of the people like William Law, the Higbees, the Fosters, the Nauvoo reformers had been basically driven from Nauvoo, so not really in the picture. While this is happening in Nauvoo, the members out in the branches, for the most part, really didn't know what was going on. They're just kind of out there. You can see how we quickly diverged. Another of John Hamer's wonderful graphics here. John pointed out to me that colors are significant here as well. So the blues and the greens are kind of more moderate, and the yellows and the oranges become increasingly less moderate. So color makes a difference in these maps as well. You can see kind of the path that many followed and who split off from who. Gives you an idea of where people went as folks start scattering. William Smith, Palestine, Illinois, very close to Amboy, Illinois. James Strang ends up on Beaver Island, Michigan. William McClellan, Gladden Bishop back to Kirtland. Sidney Rigdon back to Monongahela, Pennsylvania. Lyman White to Texas. We had been negotiating prior to Joseph's death with Sam Houston about removing to Texas. Might have been also after that, continued after Joseph's death. Lyman White said, well, Joseph gave me a mission to go to Texas. I know Joseph has been killed, but I'm going. I'm going to fulfill my mission. So off to Texas he went. Many of his followers end up in the reorganization eventually. Charles Thompson, Preparation, Iowa. They also get folded into the reorganization, as do many of Alpheus Cutler's followers, some of David Whitmer's followers. Touched on Strang briefly. He was relatively new member to the church at Joseph's death. He was amazingly successful early on. He was having visions and finding and translating plates. Very, very, very charismatic. You can see a list of some of those who supported Strang early, really important folk like William Marks, William Smith, Lucy Smith, Joseph's mom, John Page, David Whitmer, John C. Bennett. Now, when Strang fellowship Bennett, that upset a lot of people. Some left because they thought John C. Bennett, who had been the mayor of Nauvoo and a leader of the church in Nauvoo, was a scoundrel, and I think they're right. But Strang had pretty significant followers, thousands eventually. He eventually was shot on Beaver Island by a disgruntled follower. Somebody had had horsewhipped for adultery. There was a U.S. naval vessel in the harbor at Beaver Island. The suspects jumped on the naval ship. The sheriff went to the captain and demanded that he turn over the suspects. The captain refused and instead sails with them to Mackinac Island, which was fighting it out for economic supremacy up there at the Straits of Mackinac with Beaver Island, and Beaver Island was winning in that battle. Strang had managed to get himself elected to the Michigan State Legislature, was passing legislation to favor Beaver Island over Mackinac Island. So the folks of Mackinac did not like him at all. They had a mock trial for the folks who shot Strang, acquitted them, and then carried them around the town on their shoulders as heroes. Strang lingered for about 30 days. He didn't die initially, but he refused to name a successor. There are, of course, still members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Strangite, out there. Another option we talked about, William Smith. He had kind of gone public with polygamy in the 1840s before members of the 12 were ready. So he was in conflict with Brigham Young. He also, as the patriarch of the church, after Joseph's death, had significant familial authority, and the apostles didn't really know what to do with that. So also in conflict. As I mentioned earlier, Smith is preaching monogamy, but eventually secretly practicing polygamy. When he reveals that to some followers, they kick him to the curb. So a bunch of people that had followed Strang and were disgruntled, upset, a bunch of people that had followed William Smith, but rejected William Smith, those are the people who would come back together and form the Reorganization. Among them, Jason Briggs, who had followed Strang, a former William Smith apostle as well, and Zenas Gurley, who had also previously followed Strang. You see a map with some of the areas where the Reorganization would really begin to take root. Dan, where do you live?
I live in Minneapolis, but that's part of our mission center.
Okay. Some of these areas are Dan's specialty.
I give tours of that area if anybody wants to go.
Nice. Maybe one of the most important, I think probably the most important early member, William Marks. Again, he'd been the Nauvoo State President, the President of the High Council, was a good friend of the Smith family. He was in Fulton, where Emma fled to escape the Battle of Nauvoo. He had followed or looked for pure expressions of the church after Joseph Jr.'s death. He'd been a Rigdonite for a while, a Strangite, a Thompsonite, then eventually found his way into the new organization, what would become the Reorganization. Fine man. Again, just showing you where some of the folks land.
An area you might want to talk to John about, important there, is up in Winnipeg area. Jane Post from Sidney Rigdon's group was the presiding elder of the church in Canada.
Yeah, I think that eventually Sidney is basically running a church in Manitoba through post by mail, kind of providing instructions to him up there.
Yeah.
In the meantime, the Smith children are growing to adulthood in Nauvoo. Joseph III had studied law for a while in Canton, Illinois. He was doing some farming. Some really important experiences in his life, though, happened in 1856. He had married Emmeline Griswold. Her family were Presbyterians and not really fans of Joseph III or Mormonism. But at some point, as Joseph III was working in the fields with Christopher and Putnam Yates, they got on the topic, as they often did, of religion. And the Yates started to ask Joseph III questions about the potential of going west. You know, what might it look like if you were to go to Utah? You might be able to take control of the church and reform it from within. Maybe you could put an end to polygamy and clear your father's name. And if you aren't interested in running the church, maybe you could just go west, and almost certainly you would be welcomed and you would soon be rich. You could have 3 or 4 wives. And of course, this is horrifying to Joseph III, but it caused him to step back and start to wonder, well, how much of this is just the prejudice of myself and my mom? You know, maybe I really should consider this. But he had an experience that he came away with, an understanding that the light in which he stood is greater than theirs, meaning not going to go. That comes about after a visit by George A. Smith and Erastus Snow, both apostles. And as Roger Launius, if you've not read this Joseph III bio by Roger Launius, you should. Joseph Smith III, Pragmatic Prophet. Really, really good book, very important book. Launius, for years, was NASA's chief historian with the Smithsonian for a while. He points out that this visit by apostles George A. Smith and Erastus Snow were really the last time that the church in Utah invited Joseph III to come out. Again, he not seriously, but thinking a little bit about it, but then has this experience. I heard a slight noise like the rush of a breeze. I turned my gaze slightly upward and saw descending towards me a sort of cloud, funnel-shaped with the widest part upwards. It was luminous and of such color and brightness that it was clearly seen, though the sun shone in its summer strength. It descended rapidly and settling upon and over me enveloped me completely so that I stood in its radiance. The light that in which you stand is greater than theirs, he heard. So in some ways, kind of like his own first vision experience, that sealed it for him. Joseph III knew that going west was not an option for him, not something for him to consider. Also in 56, 2 elders for the infant reorganization visit, Samuel Gurley and E.C. Briggs. They had a letter for Joseph III, basically inviting him to come and affiliate with them. And Joseph III listened politely. Then they read this letter and he was not impressed. He stopped just short of kicking them out of his house. He said he's happy to talk to them about politics or anything else, but not religion. These 2 men were on, as they understood it, a mission from God. And they had great confidence that Joseph III would respond to their invitation in a positive way. When he did not, they were crushed. So crushed that Gurley started crying. Briggs just got mad. Things calmed down and they left, and then they met at Emma's home the next day and talked a little more, but didn't go as they had hoped. One of them, though, ended up staying in Nauvoo and associating with Joseph III for a significant period of time. And almost certainly that ongoing contact would have been really important in Joseph III's decision later to join with us. Joseph III also had some significant personal problems, some financial difficulties. He was in a partnership at the farm, the family farm, with his brother Frederick. Frederick eventually dies, but that caused a lot of stress, of course. Some family issues, his wife's family not supportive, children ill and dying. So all of those things lead to Joseph III's decision to write to William Marks and say, I've been considering it for a number of years. I feel like I would like to join with this new organization. William Marks' response was not what Joseph III was expecting. Here's what Mark said: "We've had enough of man-made prophets, and we don't want any more of that sort. If God has called you, we want to know it. If he has, the church is ready to sustain you. If not, we want nothing to do with you." Again, a bit of a surprise to Joseph III. But Joseph III did, of course, affiliate on April 6th of 1860. He and Emma rowed across the Mississippi by John Gifford, James Gifford, a family friend, just right outside the window where I'm sitting now. They rowed across the Mississippi to to Montrose, Iowa, to catch a train to go north, to cross back over the Mississippi River on a bridge and then head over to Amboy, Illinois, to join with the new organization. Here's what Joseph III said on that day: "I say to you as a people that God has promised his blessings upon. I came not here of myself, but by the influence of the Spirit. I wish to say that I have come here not to be dictated by any men. I have come in obedience to a power not of my own, and shall be dictated by the power that sent me. I come to you if you will receive me, give my ability and the influence my name may bring, together with what little power I possess, and I trust by your prayers and faith to be sustained." the church is soon starting to reclaim lost members. So as we had left Nauvoo, many of us in February of 46 and over the 9 months following, a lot of people made it out into southwestern Iowa as they start heading west, but they, for whatever reason, drop off and don't make it all the way to Utah. So lots of early members were scattered in southwestern Iowa, and we sent missionaries out to work with those people and began finding old-time Latter-day Saints and inviting them into the reorganization with really pretty significant success. So you see where branches are soon, or congregations soon established throughout southwestern Iowa. Back in Nauvoo, things did not initially go very well for Joseph III when he joined with the reorganization here. Some of the locals got a little concerned, this idea of, oh, here we go again. They had visions of marching militias and secret plural marriage and et cetera. So they start passing resolutions, township by township, forbidding Joseph Smith III from preaching or praying in those places. Now, that's obviously problematic on many levels, and it angered Joseph III pretty significantly. So he vowed to stay right here and do as he pleased for a period of 5 years. He did. He moved to Plano on January 1 of 1866. So he got his 5 years in and then moved on to Plano, Illinois, where there were a concentration of members, and the church press was there, the Herald being printed there. So by 1860, you can't preach or pray here. By 1877, 300 or 400 Nauvoo residents are signing a petition asking Joseph III to please move his headquarters to Nauvoo. I think that is a stunning reversal in 17 years. They had come to realize that Joseph III's form of Mormonism was different than his dad's. It was not a threat. And even people like Thomas Sharp, who was a newspaper editor from Warsaw, Illinois, and called for the use of powder and ball to be rid of the Mormon problem. If there's any one person most responsible for Joseph Smith Jr.'s death, it's Thomas Sharp. But in 1860, Thomas Sharp defended Joseph III's right to practice his religion. I'll paraphrase, but he said something like, young Joe's not like old Joe. You know, he doesn't have a militia. The things he is doing do not threaten me. He has every right to practice his religion unmolested. Let me pause there for a minute. Questions on it, on the reorganization period, questions on Nauvoo, or really anything else that we've covered or haven't?
How much was Emma pursued by various faction leaders?
So I think James Strang would have hoped that Emma would have supported him. I don't have any evidence that she did. Lucy, as I mentioned, did. I don't know. I think they desperately wanted her to join because it would have brought credibility to any of the movements. But I don't know, because Emma didn't have a journal or didn't leave a journal, specific accounts where people are sitting down with Emma and asking her to join. Obviously, the 12 had hoped that she would go west. My sense is she just wasn't really interested in talking about it. She was raising her children in a Christian home, but not necessarily, after Joseph's death, a Latter-day Saint home. Joseph III talks about the role of religion in Nauvoo, and social life centered around religion. So, you know, young people were constantly at church, but it might be Catholic or Methodist or Presbyterian. I think Emma did attend, I believe, Methodist services after Joseph's death. But I really think she had sacrificed enough and wasn't particularly interested in in going through that again. Now, having said that, she never discouraged her children from participating. And when Joseph III went to Amboy, Emma went with him and joined the reorganization. Sometimes people want to argue because she wasn't baptized into the reorganization, but most prominent members were not. We made a point of accepting them on their original baptisms because we understood we were the original church. Why would you be rebaptized? It would be the mindset. Mormon Enigma, the best book on Emma. Emma Hale Smith, Mormon Enigma.
Questions. How many of the apostles went west? And secondly, did the people who go west with Brigham Young, were they all rebaptized?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
Yeah, Dan, I'd be nervous about that. So words like all.
Well, if they didn't do it in Council Bluffs, they did it when they got out to Salt Lake.
Yeah, but it's kind of an unfair old-time RLDS argument. What they were often doing was, now in Nauvoo, you could be baptized for many, many reasons. You could be baptized to join the church. You could be baptized for the dead by proxy. You could be baptized for the remission of sins. You could be baptized for healing. You could be baptized as a sign of recommitment. And a lot of people were baptized going west as a sign of recommitment, basically their support for the 12, but they were not being baptized because they believed they were a new church.
No, but they were doing the official records because supposedly the records were lost on the way out there. And during the resurgence time, 1857, they rebaptized everybody.
Yeah, what Dan's referring to is the Reformation. So they went through a period in 57 where they really cracked down on the people. And they went to great lengths to enforce orthodoxy. And so again, many of them would have been rebaptized as a sign of recommitment. Many would also have consecrated all of their property to the church at that point in time. You had to sign documents, basically giving everything you had to the church. Now they wouldn't necessarily take it, but they expected you to express your commitment in that way. So the Reformation is kind of a scary time in Utah when they are super, I don't even know the right word.
It's right after the Mountain Meadow Massacre.
Is it after or before?
It's right after it. That's why they called them all home. San Bernardino broke up and a third of the people went back to Salt Lake. The rest stayed on and went RLDS.
And Claire, what was the other part of your question? The 12.
How many of the 12 went west?
So it's easier for me to think of the ones that didn't. William Smith didn't. Lyman White didn't. John Page didn't. Are we forgetting anybody?
Nope.
So I think it's a majority of the 12 who go west. There probably are 30,000 members of the church at that time. We often use very inflated numbers. Probably 30,000 members. I used to think, well, I still think the majority go west, although John Hamer has some pretty good arguments about this that make me want to start to reconsider. But a guy named Dean May did some of the best demographic work I've seen. He thinks that there are about 30,000 members at Joseph's death. About 20,000 of those are in Nauvoo or surrounding areas, and about 69% of those go west, he says. Now, does that mean they made it all the way? And I don't know that we know that. Okay, so as I mentioned, Joseph III by 1866 is moving to Plano, Illinois. That became our church headquarters. The print shop is there, not far outside of Chicago. You see a picture of what's often thought of as the first church of the Reorganization, the Plano Stone Church. Lots of conferences, general conferences in Plano, lots of significant events in the life of the church. Emma Smith dies in 1879 in Nauvoo. You see her cenotaph, an above ground empty tomb in the foreground there in front of the homestead. This is a hymn that was sung at Emma's funeral, one of my favorites. If you were on the Historic Sites Foundation Hymn Festival, you heard this hymn, Asleep in Jesus. Soon we are focusing our attention overseas, and we start sending folks around the world. One of my favorite images is Gospel Wagon. I think that one's in Australia. I haven't looked at it lately. This one definitely in Tahiti. So let's talk about the church in French Polynesia for a little bit. So Charles Wesley Wandell had gone to Australia in the 1850s for the 12. He is not a big fan of polygamy though, and eventually leaves the Mormons, finds his way into the Reorganization. He's going back in the early 1870s to Australia with Claude Rogers. As they're sailing, their boat breaks down in French Polynesia. And as they're waiting for it to be repaired, they bump into one of the native people who kept saying, "Adio pra, adio pra." And they finally realized that he was saying Addison Pratt, the name of one of the early missionaries that had opened the work of the church in French Polynesia in the 1840s. They followed this man back to his village and discovered hundreds of church members that had been basically abandoned because the French government had thrown all missionaries out of French Polynesia. So they had had no contact with any expression of the church for a decade or two. Being good missionaries, Wandell and Rogers quickly re-baptize everybody, which is of course why at conferences today, we have these wonderful Tahitian delegations singing so beautifully. They continued on to Australia and reestablished the Reorganization there. I had family being baptized by the 1880s and 90s up and down the Pacific coast in Australia. By 1881, we are moving west to Lamoni, Iowa, eventually would be named. There were a lot of members who loved this idea of gathered community, but Joseph III was a little nervous about it. He had lived through his father's experiments enough to see what can go wrong. So Lamoni is established very carefully. Rather than a church community, it's created by a joint stock company that basically sells shares. And they had purchased land in Decatur County, Iowa, and carefully established Lamoni. There was some desire for a school among the local Methodist community. I think we're initially not fans, but eventually are convinced Graceland University grows out of that experience. And I think some might argue that Lamoni has been our most successful experiment at community building. Joseph III is there by the early 1880s and then moves to Independence, Missouri by 1914. Actually, it's 1906. Reunions, critically important in our church experience. So reunions grow out of the fact that early on, we have general conferences twice a year. But by the early 1880s, we are debating about the expense of gathering like that. Should we continue to have general conferences twice a year or maybe just once a year? And at a general conference held in Kirtland Temple, the decision was made to go to once a year. Joseph III was opposed to that, but that was the will of the body. But as a kind of an interesting offset in some ways, Charles Derry and another gentleman come up with the idea of gathering together and doing a reunion of the church family in the place of the fall conference. So we would still have General Conference in April, but in the fall, eventually in August, we would gather as a church family. The first one of those reunions held at Leland's Grove in Shelby County, Iowa, 1883. And soon they explode in popularity. And we are having reunions all over the country and soon around the world. And it developed, of course, into one of our most beloved traditions in Community of Christ, this idea of a reunion of the church family. During Joseph Smith III's leadership, he is the president for 54 years. He brought together the early members who had many diverse paths, they had different beliefs. So how do you make a unified body out of such diverse people? What he often did is simply wait people out. He would say, you're welcome to believe in that, maybe plurality of gods, I don't know. You're welcome to believe in that, but I'm not going to give you the pages of the Herald to teach it. And you can't teach it from the pulpit. And so eventually those ideas simply die out in the reorganization. This is an oversimplification, but Joseph III returned us to what he understood the Kirtland church to look like. As Alma Blair would call it, moderate Mormonism. During Joseph III's leadership, we grew from 300 members to 72,000 members. He edited the Herald for decades, published the inspired version of the Bible, is involved in the Order of Enoch, which establishes Lamoni, establishes Graceland University, adds 17 revelations to the Doctrine and Covenants, including section 116. Just as the US Civil War came to an end, there were questions about the role of our Black members and priesthood. In the early church, in Joseph Smith Jr.'s day, Black members were ordained, but we didn't have Black members, I think, by 1865. And so the US was, imagine how politicized it would have been and what a contentious time it was as the Civil War came to a close. Questions were being asked, well, what are we going to do with Black members? Can they be ordained? Members of the 12 were asked those questions. They were too afraid to answer. So they asked Joseph III to go in prayer, and he comes back with section 116, saying that we should ordain Black men. Also, eventually, Joseph III makes it back to Jackson County, Missouri. I'm going to pause again for questions. Joseph III's widowed twice, married 3 times, had 17 kids. 3 of his sons would later follow him in the presidency, the 3rd of whom became our prophet president 98 years after his father had.
Would you comment on Enoch?
On the Order of Enoch, so it was an attempt growing out of our early efforts at communal living. I touched briefly, I think, earlier on the idea that early on, you didn't have to, but if you joined us, you could consecrate your property to the church. They would give back to you what you needed for your just wants and needs, and then the surplus would go to those in need, inspired by the book of Acts. Fairly quickly, we start modifying that. And by Nauvoo, we're pretending that we were never communitarians, which is kind of funny. But the reason for communal ownership, concern for the plight of the poor, didn't leave us. So even in Nauvoo, for example, we are collective farming, the big farm. So many families working together on property, for example. So the Order of Enoch is inspired by those attempts, but done in a different way. Again, a joint stock company that you could invest in and would buy property and then kind of carefully parcel it out. I think Ron Romig and Ann Romig have done some wonderful work on stewardship and consecration. It's a little paperback. I wonder if I can figure out how to get a copy to you. Ron and Ann Romig on consecration, some of the best stuff.
Yeah, I like Joseph Smith's third beard.
Yeah. I can't see you, Claire. You're not on my screen, but I think I know why you like it. He's a pretty dapper dresser there, isn't he?
Yeah.
Locke, I'm thinking about that last picture that you have there, that they had the waits out old members, creates a vision of a Kirtland, Missouri era of Mormonism. If right from the beginning, we were very tolerant of different sorts of ideas because we had to be.
No question, and much, much, much more tolerant than the folks in the West. We are the dissenters. We're the people who wouldn't go West. So we are, I think, very open to opposing, not just different, but even opposing thoughts. We protect dissent. I remember at a world conference a number of years ago, somebody got up on the floor and said something, and people started to boo him. Now, it wasn't a nice thing that he said, but President McMurray chastised the body for booing, even though the guy was probably attacking President McMurray. I can't remember, but we value and protect dissent. Now, I got to say, I think that broke down a little bit coming out of 1984 and the ordination of women. I think we moved away from that a bit, but with our statement on faithful disagreement, I think we're back in that place where we are comfortable with dissent, but we do kind of lay out how it is appropriately expressed and when it is not appropriate to express. Once an issue has been decided by the church in public ministry, you either have to support that position or simply don't talk about it. It's not appropriate to attack once established as a position.
When I was in seminary, one of my favorite things was a letter that Joseph Smith III wrote to someone, and he said that we would have to just wait for timely passings. I love that phrase.
I like that. I'm going to have to figure out how to work that into some sermons. Timely passings. Anything else? How about questions? On anything. Surely there are things that we have not covered, since this has been incredibly condensed, that you've wondered about.
Locke, I actually have a question on that section 116.
Yep.
You presented it as Joseph Smith III bringing forth this revelation that approves the ordination of Black people, or at least at that point in time, Black men. It's curious, though, that often I've seen people in other factions of the Restoration movement criticize that because of some of the wording in it talking about be not hasty.
Yeah.
So I just am curious your own thoughts on what Joseph Smith was saying in that revelation, or what God was saying through Joseph Smith in that revelation.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon to bump into people who have left Mormonism, particularly, who get upset at this. And I think what's happening is presentism, meaning judging through the lens of the present things in the past. So I believe this to be, particularly in the closing days of the US Civil War, a really progressive position. But it is not really progressive from a 2020 perspective. It does say, be not hasty, but we said the same thing about ordaining women in 1984. We set aside a period of time for preparation. I think that only makes sense. I don't think it's inappropriate or worthy of attack. I think some also say it talks about priests. Now, Joseph III interpreted that to mean priesthood, but some members understood it to mean the office of priest. And I think he didn't feel like it was worth battling over. I think he wanted to keep moving us in the right direction. And so I'm slightly uncomfortable that they ended up going with priests for a time, or in some places anyway. I think what really we should be focused on is how in a number of places for generations, we did not live up to this, meaning there are places where we've done a wonderful job in treating our members of color as equal, but we failed miserably in some places at some times. Just heartbreaking stories of the way we have treated some of our Black members in the South, or not just in the US South, in other places as well.
We also need to remember that under Joseph Jr., sometimes you were baptized and then sent on your mission as an elder, ordained right away. This revelation comes after the Civil War, where a lot of people are going into the South and creating African-American slaves into something different for their own purpose.
Yeah.
Bring them into their churches as deacons and things like that, just because they wanted to show up the South. I think that's my interpretation of being, hasty.
Yeah. There's also a passage that almost sounds like segregated congregations are okay. And I think the reality is that, well, I don't know if that was his intent, but I think that's what happened at times. And still not so much. When you look at our congregations, even today, we often are segregated, not intentionally, but often based on neighborhoods and things like that. So unfortunately, often still lived out.
Yeah. Post-World War II, the saints who came back to Detroit were told there was no church in Detroit and they had to go up to Pontiac, even though there was a church central in Detroit.
Yeah. Painful. So
yep.
Opportunities to confess and repent.
Yep.
Other question?
I was just going to ask if you wanted to say something about the Joseph Smith translation.
Sure. So I believe that the Joseph Smith translation is Joseph's attempt to make sense of elements or passages in the Bible that don't seem to make sense or might contradict other statements. So to reconcile elements. So I understand it to be Joseph's commentary on the King James Version of the Bible. And it was a not uncommon thing to do at the time in the US anyway. Even earlier, Thomas Jefferson had his own version of the Bible. Suffragette leaders in the US did as well. So not particularly uncommon, but Joseph's attempt to reconcile what felt like problematic passages. So I think it's helpful and a valuable tool, but really to understand Joseph's understanding of the King James Version in the 1830s and 40s. I also believe that Joseph was comfortable using the best and earliest manuscripts. So if Joseph were alive today, I believe he would be comfortable with things like the New Revised Standard Version that have access to earlier manuscript materials.
I understood from the session we had with Dale Luffman that Joseph called his translation the Holy Scriptures, but it was the printers who called it the inspired version, and there are some people in the church who don't want to use that word anymore as being inspired version. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that people misunderstand the intent. I think some people hear inspired version and interpret that to mean this one is inspired and no others are. I have always understood inspired to mean that is the method through which it was produced. It was produced through inspiration, because Joseph, although he studied Latin and Greek and Hebrew, had not yet studied Latin and Greek and Hebrew when he was doing this work. I do like Holy Scriptures better. I've done, just by accident, some looking at it, and we are using inspired version earlier than I had thought, but I don't think that is what Joseph called it, but I need to go back and do more word searches. I'm just real quick, I think we're done, but Fred M, and then it's followed by Israel A. Smith, his full brother, followed by their half-brother, W. Wallace Smith, followed by his son, Wallace B. That label is wrong, Wallace B. Smith. And then, of course, to Grant McMurray, Steve Easy. Whew. So there's way too much information to try and get through here. I apologize for that. I don't know how much time we have. I'm happy to keep trying to answer questions.
Locke, I was wondering about succession to Israel A. You know, I mean, we were into sons following their fathers, at least at one point, and he did have sons, correct?
Yeah, Israel did have sons. I wonder if it was more lineal or more father to son. I need to think about that for a little bit. I think we probably would have thought that that brother is okay.
Right.
Yeah, the succession to following Israel is pretty interesting too. You know, killed in a car accident. It's not always been as clear cut as we often think it is. It's been a little messy at times, and inviting folks in. I think that might have been Fred M to Israel to participate in the process.
Were his sons involved in church, or had they kind of gone another way?
I only know about one of his sons, Don, who I'm confident would have been involved, but I think he ran the Social Security department in Independence. I also think he had a pretty significant drinking problem. And I don't know beyond Don. I actually don't remember if he had other sons than Don. But I don't think that his kids would have been in a position to provide leadership.
We had the Alexander Smith family of Minnesota who were up in the Bemidji area, and they all went with the Temple Lot Church. But we had a lot of fun with them because Alexander was able to be the president if everybody else had croaked too.
Yeah, Alexander died in 1909, even though he's younger, of course, than Joseph III.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, my joke to you and to Dave Wilson is in Minnesota, we got Sandy Newcomb here as the pastor of our St. Paul Church. And if we were to have a new president from either you or Sandy, I think I'd pick Sandy.
Yeah, I would too. I would happily pick anybody else.
Yeah.
So if you come up with questions in the future, feel free to email me. I'm happy to try and help. It's been a privilege to be with you. I think it would have been more fun to be in person, but there's always next year.
All right.
Hallelujah. Amen to
It
that.
was great, Locke.
Thanks, Locke.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Locke. It was
Yep.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take
Bye.
care, everyone.
Love that background.
Yeah.